Stop. We are not commencing this story with a bang, but with a whisper, the chilling, unheeded whisper of prophecy. In the history of naval warfare, few figures possess the tragic foresight of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. While the Japanese Empire celebrated its unprecedented sweeping victories across the Pacific, from the fall of Singapore to the capture of the Philippines, Yamamoto stood as a chilling anomaly. He was the architect of Pearl Harbor, yet he was the most vocal internal critic of the war itself. He understood something that the Imperial Army's firebrands and the Navy's expansionists utterly failed to grasp. The moment the war began, Japan had already lost. His colleagues, blinded by immediate success, saw the vast Pacific as a stage for unlimited imperial ambition. Yamamoto saw it as a colossal, logistical black hole. He knew the true measure of war was not the bravery of the individual soldier, but the output of the assembly line. He possessed a profound, almost intimate understanding of the American industrial military complex, having studied at Harvard and served as a naval attaché in Washington, D.C. He saw the steel mills of Pittsburgh, the endless forests of timber, and the oil derricks of Texas, and he knew that Japan, a resource-poor island nation, could not possibly compete in a war of attrition. He issued his famous, desperate warning. Japan had only 6 months, maybe a year, of strategic advantage. If they could not force a negotiated peace within that time frame, before the full fury of American industrial might could be unleashed, then the war was irrevocably lost. This was not pessimism. It was cold, hard, strategic calculus. It was the truth of inevitable failure that the high command refused to let penetrate their bubble of victory fever. The Imperial General Headquarters, however, was deafened by the roar of cannon fire and the cheers of the home front. They rejected Yamamoto's strategic caution, viewing it as a lack of fighting spirit, a failure of Bushido. Instead of focusing on a quick, decisive blow for peace, they pursued ambitious, sprawling plans for further expansion. Operation MO to capture Port Moresby, further movements toward the Aleutians, and, most alarmingly, a long-term goal of isolating Australia. Yamamoto fought these expansionist fantasies with every fiber of his being. He knew that scattering their resources and stretching their defensive perimeter thousands of miles past the point of sustainable logistics was the equivalent of committing strategic suicide. His focus remained laser-sharp on one, and only one, objective: the American aircraft carriers. The carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, the survivors of Pearl Harbor, were the only assets that could project power across the ocean and deliver a counterpunch. Yamamoto's entire strategic weight was thrown behind Operation MI, the assault on Midway Atoll. It was conceived as the ultimate decisive engagement, a trap designed to lure the remaining U.S. fleet into a final, crushing battle that would eliminate America's offensive capability and finally bring Washington to the negotiating table. This was Yamamoto's last, desperate gamble to prove his own prophecy wrong, or at least to mitigate its catastrophic cost. He meticulously planned the operation, pooling the bulk of the remaining Imperial combined fleet. He was gambling everything on the belief that strategic shock and a decisive victory could overcome the cold, hard logic of industrial parity. But as with all Greek tragedies, the fates were already turning against him, and the Americans were about to deliver a psychological blow that would derail even his meticulous planning, forcing him to rush his timeline and thus guaranteeing the very disaster he sought to avert. That blow was the Doolittle raid. The ripple effect of a single, audacious air attack would ultimately decide the battle for Midway and open the gates to the blood-soaked island that the world would soon know as Guadalcanal. The ghost of defeat was not in the future. It was already seated at the Japanese planning table. If Yamamoto's warnings were the seeds of tragedy, the Doolittle raid was the cruel catalyst that accelerated their bloom. The success of the Japanese war machine had created a powerful national illusion. The home islands were an unbreachable sanctuary, protected by the divine emperor and an invincible military perimeter. That illusion was shattered by 15 American B-25 Mitchell bombers. The attack on April 18, 1942, was more a psychological operation than a tactical one. The material damage was negligible. The emotional damage was crippling. For the first time, Japanese citizens saw American bombers overhead. For the first time, the military leadership's promises of absolute safety were exposed as a catastrophic lie. This humiliation struck at the very core of national honor, and the credibility of the audacious defiance accomplished what weeks of naval planning could not. It gave Admiral Yamamoto the political weapon he needed. The clamor for swift retribution, for eliminating the source of these surprise attacks, the American carriers, became deafening. The raid transformed the strategic urgency of Midway into an overwhelming emotional necessity for the empire. Yamamoto was forced to rush his meticulously planned timetable. The element of surprise, which had been compromised by U.S. code breaking, a fact unknown to Yamamoto, was now further diminished by haste. The resultant Battle of Midway, June 1942, was the inevitable culmination of this strategic arrogance and psychological shock. It was a disaster born of overconfidence and poor communication. The Japanese, believing their intelligence to be superior, sailed into a trap set by the Americans, who, thanks to decryption efforts, knew the exact time, place, and composition of the attacking force. The Japanese fleet lost 4 irreplaceable fleet carriers, Ikagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, along with hundreds of their most experienced pilots. The loss was not merely material, it was the crippling, permanent destruction of the Imperial Navy's offensive capability. This single battle proved Yamamoto's prophecy correct. They had lost their critical advantage. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of Midway was the silent catastrophe that followed. The Imperial High Command could not afford to admit defeat. To maintain the illusion of invincibility, the news of the Midway disaster was suppressed, covered up, and outright lied about, both to the Japanese people and, critically, to the military units scattered throughout the Pacific. This denial had profound operational consequences. Commanders in the field were never truly apprised of the crippling loss of air power. They continued to plan offensives and defensive strategies based on the false premise of 4 operational carriers supporting them. This lie ensured that every subsequent Japanese action, from this point forward, was built on a foundation of sand, a profound military mistake born from political fear and pride. The ghost of defeat had now entered the hearts of the Japanese leaders, driving them to ever more reckless, unsupported gambles. The next gamble would be a desperate attempt to shore up their southern perimeter and finish what Midway failed to achieve, the construction of a strategic airfield in the Solomon Islands. They called the island Guadalcanal. The Americans, having read the Japanese mail, knew exactly where to strike next. The stage was set for the first great American offensive, a land campaign where the lessons of Midway would be paid for in infantry blood. The location was Guadalcanal, a humid, mosquito-ridden swamp of an island, strategically located at the end of a logistical chain that spanned the entire Pacific. The Japanese, seeking to establish an outer defensive perimeter, were hastily constructing an airfield. An uncompleted dagger pointed directly at the Allied lifeline to Australia. American intelligence, privy to the Japanese planning thanks to the decrypted magic signals, knew this threat could not be ignored. Thus began the first American major offensive of World War II, Operation Watchtower. On August 7, 1942, the 1st Marine Division, under Major General Alexander Vandegrift, stormed the beaches. This was a desperate, rushed undertaking. The Marines were poorly informed about the terrain, the enemy strength, and the logistical nightmare that awaited them. They had minimal time to prepare, a clear symptom of the urgency driven by the Midway victory and the intelligence advantage. The initial landing on Guadalcanal was, deceptively, simple. The Japanese forces at Lunga Point were mostly construction crews, not battle-hardened infantry. They evaporated into the jungle, leaving behind the nearly finished airfield that would soon be known as Henderson Field. However, the easy success masked a fundamental, crippling flaw in the American command structure, a flaw rooted in the deeply ingrained conservatism of the U.S. Navy. The supporting naval force, Task Force 61, was commanded by Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. Fletcher was a veteran, but one defined by a profound, almost paralyzing fear of losing his capital ships. He was, in the words of many historians, gun-shy, operating under the perceived threat of a Japanese aerial counterattack and citing concerns about low fuel, a claim many contemporaries found dubious. Fletcher announced the unthinkable. He was withdrawing his carrier screen after just 48 hours. This decision was a catastrophic act of tactical cowardice. The Marines were barely ashore, with most of their heavy equipment, vital supplies, and defensive artillery still stacked precariously on the beach or stuck aboard the transport ships. Left the Marine landing force completely exposed. A division of men marooned on a hostile island, with no air cover whatsoever, and the logistical lifeline of the transport ships now sitting ducks for any Japanese surface attack. This unilateral decision by Fletcher instantly escalated the danger from a challenging offensive to a survival mission. It was a failure of inter-service trust and leadership that would define the opening weeks of the campaign. While the young Marines fought the enemy in the terrain, their most immediate danger came not from a Japanese bullet, but from the systemic failure and lack of resolve in their own rear command. The contrast between the aggressive, almost reckless courage of the Marines and the overly cautious, calculating fear of the Navy command creates the central tension of the Guadalcanal saga. The price of Fletcher's hesitation would soon be paid, not on the beaches, but in the treacherous black waters surrounding the island. The Japanese masters of night warfare saw the exposed transports as an unmissable opportunity for swift, surgical vengeance. The stage was set for the darkest chapter of the early American campaign. While the main force enjoyed a relatively easy landing on Guadalcanal, the battles raging across the narrow Sealark Channel, on the smaller islands of Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo, were a prelude to the true grinding horror of the Pacific War. This was where the American forces first encountered the absolute fanatical refusal to surrender that defined the Imperial Japanese military. The Japanese garrisons on these islands were composed of hardened troops of the Special Naval Landing Forces, elite, well-trained, and imbued with the unforgiving doctrine of Gyokusai, shattering like a jewel. Their mission was simple: hold their ground to the last man, inflicting maximum casualties on the enemy to bleed the Americans dry and force a psychological retreat. The resulting engagements were not battles, they were meat grinders. On Tulagi, the Marines faced expertly dug-in positions, interlocking fields of fire, and deep cave systems that transformed the island's landscape into a formidable, death trap-like fortress. The fighting was reduced to point-blank range, often hand-to-hand combat, where grenades and flamethrowers became the primary tools of eviction. The Japanese did not offer a fighting retreat, they offered only resistance until the moment of their inevitable, self-imposed deaths. Every inch of ground had to be paid for in American blood and sweat. The Marines were forced to adopt brutal, resource-intensive tactics. They learned quickly that shouting "surrender" was pointless. The enemy would wait until the Americans were close, often feigning injury or death, only to leap out with a final, desperate bayonet charge or a hidden grenade. This instilled a bitter, unforgiving necessity in the American ranks: take no prisoners. This dehumanizing reality was the first great psychological casualty of Guadalcanal. The battle for Gavutu and Tanambogo was even more hellish. The two tiny islands were connected by a causeway, and the Japanese defense was centered on a labyrinth of concrete pillboxes and cave defenses. The Marines, supported by naval shelling, fought a continuous, 54-hour close-quarters battle. It was a searing lesson in the true cost of island warfare. The enemy would not break. They would only be broken into pieces. Of the 350 Japanese defenders on Gavutu and Tanambogo, only 3 were captured alive, 2 of whom were construction workers. The rest fought or committed suicide. The total American losses in securing these small, seemingly insignificant islands were heavy, but the psychological lesson was priceless. The Pacific War would not be won by technology alone, but by overcoming a deeply entrenched, suicidal tenacity. However, as the Marines bled for these critical satellite islands, the tragedy of Admiral Fletcher's withdrawal was about to unfold on the surrounding waters. The American Naval Command, complacent in its victory over the Japanese fleet during the Coral Sea and Midway campaigns, had severely underestimated the Japanese capability in night surface action. While the American Navy was transitioning to the age of the carrier and still struggling with effective radar and night doctrine, the Japanese Imperial Navy had perfected the art of the night ambush. They possessed superior optics, excellent training in low-light conditions, and crucially, the devastating Type 93 long-lance torpedo. This weapon was far faster, had a vastly longer range, and carried a heavier warhead than anything the Allies possessed, and most terrifyingly, it left no bubble trail, making detection nearly impossible until the moment of impact, which Yamamoto predicted now arrived not by air, but stealthily beneath the blanket of the tropical night. Vice Admiral Mikawa was approaching through the slot, ready to exploit the exact moment of America's tactical blindness and strategic betrayal. The stage was set on the night of August 8th to 9th, 1942. The skies over Guadalcanal were dark, heavy with tropical clouds, perfect cover for the approaching Japanese strike force. Having slipped unseen through the slot, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa's fleet was about to execute a textbook night ambush. The Japanese had mastered the tactical art of darkness, while the American and Australian screening forces were scattered, complacent, and fatally reliant on a radar system that was still rudimentary and misunderstood. The Allied forces, under the divided command of British Rear Admiral Victor Crutchley, were woefully unprepared. Crutchley, perhaps mirroring Fletcher's lack of nerve, chose to hold a critical conference aboard the flagship HMAS Australia, leaving his fleet in fragmented, uncoordinated patrols. Just as he left the main defense line to confer, Mikawa's force of 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer burst out of the darkness. The ensuing engagement, the Battle of Savo Island, was a military massacre, a crushing defeat for the Allies and a stark demonstration of the Japanese superiority in night surface action. Mikawa's ships, utilizing their superior speed, optics, and the deadly stealthy long-lance torpedoes, achieved near-total surprise. Within the span of 40 chaotic minutes, the Allied fleet was shattered. The Japanese fired their torpedoes first, often hitting the unsuspecting Allied cruisers before the American or Australian gun crews even realized they were under attack. The result was devastating. 4 heavy cruisers were sunk: USS Astoria, USS Quincy, USS Vincennes, American, and HMAS Canberra, Australian. USS Chicago and 2 destroyers were heavily damaged. Over 1,000 Allied sailors were killed. Admiral Mikawa's victory was absolute and demoralizing. It earned the waters around Guadalcanal the terrifying nickname, Iron Bottom Sound, a graveyard of steel and men. The American Navy, fresh off the intelligence-driven triumph at Midway, was utterly humiliated, forced to confront its deep-seated technical and doctrinal shortcomings in night warfare. However, in a bizarre twist of fate, a mistake born not of tactical failure, but of ingrained doctrine, Mikawa chose to retreat immediately after sinking the cruisers. He missed the ultimate prize, the slow, defenseless American transport ships still unloading on the Guadalcanal beaches. Mikawa, operating under the conservative Japanese doctrine of preserving his fleet and fearing a dawn air attack from the now absent American carriers, withdrew before completing his objective. The Marines' logistical lifeline was spared, purely by an enemy miscalculation. The aftermath and the true awakening. The Guadalcanal campaign was instantly transformed from an offensive into a desperate defense. The Marines were now truly marooned. No air cover, Fletcher had retreated, no naval support due to Savo Island, and facing a determined, fanatical enemy. This period of isolation forced the Americans to undergo the brutal, rapid psychological and logistical awakening that Yamamoto knew was inevitable. The Marines, cut off from reliable supply, had to become self-reliant, living off captured rice and Japanese gear. They had to defend Henderson Field, their only lifeline and the primary objective, against constant suicidal counterattacks from the Japanese forces pouring in via the Tokyo Express. Fast Japanese reinforcement runs at night. The true importance of Guadalcanal, therefore, was not the island itself, but its role as a crucible for change. Doctrinal shift. The Savo Island disaster forced the U.S. Navy to admit its fatal weakness in night combat, leading to massive investments in radar technology and the immediate development of specific night fighting doctrines that would eventually lead to victory. Psychological turning point. The Marines' incredible endurance against overwhelming odds proved that American troops could and would match the fighting spirit of the Japanese, even under the most desperate conditions. The battle for Guadalcanal would drag on for 6 relentless months, becoming a slow, grinding war of attrition. Exactly the kind of war Admiral Yamamoto predicted would destroy the Imperial Empire. The initial price of American arrogance, Fletcher's retreat, Savo Island's disaster, was paid in blood, but it ultimately forced the strategic and tactical changes necessary for the Japanese finally evacuated the island in February 1943. They had lost over 24,000 troops, dozens of ships, and hundreds of aircraft. The Imperial Navy had bled itself dry in a desperate, failed effort to recapture the one airfield they should never have lost. The ghost of defeat had finally found a permanent home in the heart of the Japanese Empire. The long war had begun, and the tide irreversibly had turned.